Hi folks, so today we're going to be discussing right view. What is it? So I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director of the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're new to the channel and you're interested in helping to foster a wiser, a kinder, and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing. So today we're going to discuss right view, which is the first of the Eightfold Path, the first step along that path. And there are, I would say, three major aspects to right view in early Buddhism that are, I think, useful to us. We'll start with the first one of those, which we might call mundane right view. That's the view, basically, that there's a distinction between right action and wrong action, or doing things properly, doing things improperly, doing things skillfully, doing things unskillfully, or we might say doing things ethically or unethically. Without this basic, we might call it a foundation to our mind, we're not going to even enter on the path, because we're not going to see that there is a distinction between a right and a wrong action. Or we're going to think that that distinction somehow doesn't matter to us. And some people do think that way. They sort of think that, oh yeah, there's right and wrong, but it doesn't matter to me, or else there isn't really any right and wrong, we just make it all up. And on the Buddha's view, the morality of our action, the ethics of our action, depended upon the quality of the mind with which we made the act. So if the quality of the mind was one of loving kindness, of metta, of compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, then the act was ethical. And if it was an act that came from greed, from hatred, from delusion, then to that extent it would not be an ethical action. So the views matter to the ethics of our actions. The quality of the mind, which is fostered by the views that we hold, makes a difference to the importance of our actions ethically or skillfully, how skillful they are within the situation. And now traditionally this mundane right view also involved the acceptance of rebirth. That is to say, if you read the early texts, part of what he considers right view in this mundane aspect is believing that we're reborn into the next life. But it's important to note that the reason he thought that was because he felt that people who did not believe in rebirth would to that extent not be interested in acting ethically. In other words, if they thought that they were never not going to be reborn, if they thought that this was their only life, that they might consider that it didn't matter how they acted. If they acted badly, it didn't matter, they weren't going to be reborn in a bad state. If they acted well, they weren't going to be reborn in a positive state. And so therefore it wouldn't matter to them how they acted. And I think that's something we can push back on and say that those of us who may not have a belief in rebirth, nevertheless have a very real interest in acting skillfully and ethically. So that's mundane right view. Now there's a second aspect which has two parts to it, which we might call superior right view. And this is, in its first aspect, an understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths, just to say very quickly, the first noble truth is that life is unsatisfactory to some degree. It does not provide us permanent satisfaction. The second noble truth is that the reason that life is unsatisfactory is that we're grasping at things, we're identifying ourselves with things, we're wanting things to be other than they are. We have a kind of insatiable thirst, and this thirst is what makes the world unsatisfactory to us, because the thirst is not a thirst that can really be fully quenched. The third noble truth is that there is an escape from this, there's a way out of this predicament. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path itself. That is to say, this is the path that will lead us to that end. So superior right view is, we might say, a conceptual understanding of these four noble truths. Now, it's probably important to note that for the Buddha, lay people, at least within his lifetime, within the lifetime probably of many of his followers, and for indeed a long, long time after that, for lay people, really the important part was mundane right view. And so if the Buddha was teaching to lay people in general, he was teaching about conventional ethical issues. He was interested in getting them to understand mundane right view. This superior right view, even this conceptual understanding of the Four Noble Truths, was something that he really would not have expected lay people to know or understand. it was sort of outside of their realm of interest. Instead, it would have been something that would have been of interest to monastics in particular, people who, you might say, were professional people along the path. That was their full-time job, if you like. Now, the second aspect of this superior right view, which is the third of these three that I said, three parts of the understanding of right view, is an understanding of the Four Noble Truths that is said to penetrate the truths. And this is an understanding that is, you might say, super conceptual. It's not simply conceptual. We might even say it's not at all conceptual. It's an understanding of the truths that goes beyond training in them. So for example, if we're learning a sport like baseball, we may begin to learn the sport conceptually. We'll be told conceptually, okay, you're supposed to stand like this, you're supposed to hold the bat like this, you're supposed to keep your eye on the ball, you're supposed to swing like this. But I think we all understand that somebody who is a real expert at playing whatever sport it is can't continue that way. They can't continue in a conceptual vein because they won't get anywhere. The practice in the sport has to be internalized. We might say it has to be penetrated to the extent that their behavior is spontaneous and unself-conscious. So in the same way, this understanding of the Four Noble Truths that penetrates them is spontaneous, is unself-conscious. It's simply an awareness of the Four Noble Truths by living them. Now, there's a very, very important book, I think, out by Paul Fuller, who's an eminent scholar of early Buddhism and of actually recent Buddhism as well, called The Notion of Ditthi in Theravada Buddhism. And I've discussed this with him. He says that it's true that the title has Theravada in the title, but his conclusions are just as valid for early Buddhism as they are for Theravada in this particular instance. What he says is that this kind of right view isn't no view. It isn't the idea that one should have no views at all, because some people interpret it that way sometimes. And neither is it the idea that right view is some sort of propositional understanding, an understanding of a particular group of sentences or phrases. This kind of understanding of right view is essentially affective. That is, it has to do with the emotions. It has to do with our emotional attachments, or as a matter of fact, our lack of emotional attachments to all things, including views, our non-identification with all things, including our own views. So an understanding of the Four Noble Truths that penetrates them understands that grasping is the problem, that this thirst is the problem, and that therefore the way out of this is to cease this grasping, to cease this thirst, by ceasing to identify ourselves with things in the world and things within our own minds, in fact. In the very famous Alagadupama Sutta, the sutta about the water snake, the Buddha talks about various aspects of right view. Probably many of us will be familiar with the very famous parable of the raft, where the Buddha talks about how the Dharma is like a raft that we get into to cross a river, and once we reach the farther shore, we don't carry the raft around on our back. We leave it at the river. And in this sense, the Dharma is something that we accept as a bunch of views to an extent to take us somewhere else, at which point we cease to identify with it. Which is not to say that we don't think it's correct, which is not to say that we don't think it's accurate, which is not to say that we don't, in some sense, believe it. But it is in its depth to say that we don't identify ourselves with it. We don't think of it as mine. And how that works out in practice, the Buddha actually discusses a little bit later on in that same sutta, where he talks about the fact that if people praise him for his views, he isn't elated by it. And if people criticize him for his views, it doesn't concern him either, because, we might say, he isn't identified with them. So in this sense, right view, in its most full fruition, is a kind of affective state of mind, a state of our emotional life in which we understand that the right view, the right way to approach the world cognitively, is through a global state of non-clinging and non-identification. And that is a right view that penetrates the Noble Truths. And that is also right view that, in a sense, is non-cognitive. And I think that we can understand that this kind of approach to right view, this fruition of right view, this penetrating of the Noble Truths, would get us to a place of greater wisdom. It would get us to a place of more kindness, because we would be less invested in our own views. And of course, it would get us to a place of less stress, because we would be less invested again in whether other people agreed with us or disagreed with us. We would be less concerned with the way the world approached us in respect of our views. So these are the three aspects of right view. Mundane right view, which was mostly taught to lay people. That was ethics. It involved an ethical belief in the right way and the wrong way of doing things. Superior right view, that involved a cognitive understanding of the Noble Truths. And we might say a superior right view that penetrates the Noble Truth that was non-cognitive. So I hope that this has been useful to you. If it is, consider subscribing to the channel. Anyway, I'm really glad to have you here. If it's your first time, then welcome. And if you've been here several times, then really glad to have you back. I hope that these are useful. And thank you so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.